Okay, and welcome. Tonight we are going to learn from Lacy Rucker from West Virginia University about the cheap mountain salamander. Lacy, I'm giving it over to you.
You guys hear me okay? See my screen? Okay. All right, so like Sarah mentioned, my name is Lacy Rucker. I am a PhD candidate at West Virginia University. Right now, my current research is focused on high elevation terrestrial salamanders and how they're responding to things like climate change and habitat fragmentation. Most of my work is centered on the cheap mountain salamander as well as one of its main competitor species, which is the redback salamander. So let me get going here. I've got like 5 screens in front of me. Okay, so before we really get started today, I wanted to sort of let you know how this talk was going to be formatted. So we can't really talk about plethodonids within the Appalachian region without talking about why we have such high biodiversity here. I'm going to give you a little bit of history about the Monongahela National Forest, which will explain a lot about where the cheap mountain salamander is distributed on the landscape. I'm going to talk a little bit about amphibian declines and threats, some of the plethodon salamanders you can see in Appalachia, as well as any endemic species we have, and then of course about the cheap mountain salamander. I'm going to briefly talk about my research and my findings, and then we're going to talk about some mitigation efforts that the Forest Service is implementing in order to respond to those threats. So the Appalachian Mountains are a very broad mountain range, about 1,500 miles of unbroken mountain chain, and that stretches from Canadian provinces down to central Alabama. Now, this mountain range is characterized by its geography as well as its rich biodiversity. And the central and southern Appalachians are really unrivaled in the US for aquatic species diversity as well as salamander diversity. And they're comparable only to China as far as forest diversity goes. So this region has very diverse topography as well as geological stability over long periods of evolutionary history that has resulted in this broad range of microhabitats, as well as the presence of numerous relic species and communities. So there's a host of plant species as well as invertebrates, salamanders, crayfish, mussels that are all restricted to single peaks or single watersheds within this region because of isolation. So this mountain range can be divided into 3 main regions based on ecological and geophysical lines. So the northern section of the Appalachians extends from Canada down to around the New York-Pennsylvania border. Central Appalachia goes from PA down to the Kentucky, Virginia, Tennessee line. And that southern border is based on several ecological features like forest types, as well as geophysical features on the landscape. Now, federal ownership within the Appalachians is quite high. So about 12% of the Appalachian region is owned by the federal government and protected. So national parks own about 1,800 square miles. The U.S. Forest Service owns and manages about 25,000 square miles. Department of Defense comes in with about 1,500 square miles, and Fish and Wildlife Service owns about 300. So this region is pretty diverse and it is pretty protected by this federal ownership. And there's a lot of different physiographic provinces that are included within this mountain range. Now, land use patterns vary widely within Appalachia, and this depends a lot on the climate as well as the soils and things of that nature. Most of the Appalachians are forested, with most of the human communities within that region relying heavily on nature-based industries. So things like timber, agriculture, mining, and manufacturing were traditional mainstays of Appalachian economies through the mid 20th century. But more recently, other types of new energy development, as well as new energy development such as solar and non-traditional oil and gas, as well as wind power, have really shifted and become more economic forces within the region. So this region also still sports a lot of the more traditional outdoor recreation activities, such as sport hunting and fishing, and outdoor recreation like hiking and camping. And that's a large part of this area's cultural heritage. So what we're going to be talking today about is really this central and southern area of the Appalachians. So the Appalachian region contains what we call a biodiversity hotspot. And what that means is that the level of biodiversity within this region is really, really high comparatively to the rest of the nation. So this region does contain the most significant biodiversity hotspot east of the Rocky Mountains, and it is the largest contiguous hotspot area in the nation. We talked briefly about how they're unrivaled for aquatic diversity as well as salamander diversity. So there are over 6,300 plant species within this region, and they're known as providing habitat for over 250 birds, 78 mammals, 58 reptiles, and 76 amphibians. So 1/3 of the world's salamander species are housed within this region or within the United States, and the highest concentration of these is found within the Appalachian Mountains. So they house about 14% of the world's salamander species in the central and southern Appalachians. This region also has the highest number of endemic species within the nation. So endemic only means that it's only found in that region. It can't be found anywhere else in the world. So there's actually a new species of lungless salamander discovered in Georgia that was described in 2007. And that species was so distinctive, both genetically and morphologically, that it actually warranted the description of a new genus. And that was the first, it had been 50 years, I guess, since the previous genus had been described. So there are a ton of T&E species within the Appalachians, and there are about 198 in that region that are federally protected, either classified as threatened or endangered. Now, the Appalachians also serve as a critical migration corridor for over 65 high priority migratory bird species as well. So there are a couple of different reasons why we see this high biodiversity in the Appalachian region. The first is that this region was largely unglaciated during the last thermal maximum. So these mountains have been around for a very long time. Those uprisings for these mountains occurred about 650 to 350 million years ago. And they've weathered over the years from peaks of about 5,000 meters to what we see today, which is peaks of about 2,000. So that last thermal maximum occurred about 10,000 years ago, and many parts of that northern range of the Appalachians is still recovering from that last ice age. But the central and southern Appalachians, like I mentioned previously, were unglaciated. So that means that it served as isolated climatic refugia for many boreal and subtropical species. And a lot of the diversity that we see in plethodonids was also occurring during and after this time. So the next reason that we see this high level of biodiversity in the Appalachians is the elevational gradients that we see in these unglaciated regions. So these gradients create a diverse array of microclimates with climatic and habitat characteristics at the peaks of those mountains, often differing substantially from valley floors and gorges. So these elevational gradients, they allow for short range migrations to accomplish temperature changes that, if we were in plain states, would require migrations hundreds of miles to achieve the same result. So this is likely the reason why we see a lot of slow moving organisms with low vigility. Vigility means movement ability, that are endemic to this Appalachian region, because they are able to migrate to ideal conditions more so than they would be in other areas within the nation. So in addition to these elevational gradients, the central and southern Appalachians also house temperate rainforests. So these areas are considered to be temperate rainforests because they receive a lot of precipitation, and they also have relatively mild temperature fluctuations. So now that we've talked a little bit about the Appalachian region as a whole, I want to sort of hone in to West Virginia and the Central Appalachians, since that's where most of the rest of my talk is set today. So I want to sort of give you a visual for what I mean whenever I say Central Appalachians. So this extent is based on both ecological and geophysical features on the landscape. So that extent starts in southern New York, just above the Pennsylvania border, around Allegheny, New York, around Allegheny State Park. And then it continues south to, again, like I said before, the Kentucky, Virginia, and Tennessee border. Now that southern border is based on forest types as well as geophysical structures on the landscape. So this area does fall within 7 states. Those are New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, Maryland, Virginia, and Kentucky. So we've talked a little bit about the Appalachians. Before we can really talk about the Cheat Mountain salamander, it's important to understand what happened in West Virginia and why the Monongahela National Forest came about. So we don't have a lot of descriptive data on the original forests of West Virginia. Probably the first description that we have available to us comes from George Washington, whenever he was exploring the virgin forests in the state along the Great Valley of the Great Canal. So on November 4th, 1770, while he was traveling along the Kanawha River, he wrote in his journal that, the quote is listed here, "Just as we came to the hills, we were met with a sycamore of a most extraordinary size, it measuring 3 feet from the ground, 45 feet round, lacking 2 inches, and not 50 yards from it was another 31 feet round." Now, another quote almost 100 years later in 1870 describes that at least 10 million acres of the 16.6 million acres of land in West Virginia are still in all the vigor and freshness of the original growth. So this tells us that West Virginia was relatively untouched prior to 1870. Now, of course, after 1870, this began to change. So in the state of West Virginia, we had a ton of red spruce, which is a very valuable logging tree. And red spruce occurred over vast areas on both the tops of mountains as well as on plateaus within the state of West Virginia. Now, prior to the turn of the century logging, we had about 469,000 acres of red spruce in the Allegheny Forest contained in West Virginia. And these red spruce were typically 60 to 90 feet tall with a diameter of 2 to 4 feet. So the greatest stand of red spruce in the world, both in terms of quantity and quality, could be found along the upper Red Creek drainage, what is now the Dolly Sods Wilderness. Unfortunately, though, at the turn of the century, much of that red spruce forest was clear cut, including that Red Creek drainage, as well as most of the Dolly Sods Wilderness and the Monongahela National Forest. So it's been estimated that from 1879 to 1912, the total cut of lumber in West Virginia was more than 20 billion board feet. So that's billion with a B. This number represents the lumber from about 8.5 million acres of virgin forest and more than 85% of the total timbered area of the state. So by 1920, we had jumped up to 30 billion board feet. And just to give you a visual of how much timber that is, if you were to take all of that lumber and build a boardwalk that was 127 feet wide, 2 inches thick, you could wrap around the circumference of the world. So a lot of timber came out of this region. And I pulled these photos from the Forest Service archive at the Monongahela National Forest headquarters. So this is over here in your upper left-hand corner, this is the largest tree that was discovered in the state. This was cut in the late 1890s. This middle photo here on the top is Stewart's Knob Recreation Area, which is just outside of Elkins, West Virginia, if you guys are familiar with the Monongahela National Forest. Over in this top right-hand corner, we can see a coal-fired locomotive, which was what they used to pull that timber out of the mountains. Down here on the left, we have the Cherry River sawmill that pulled a bunch of timber out of Pocahontas County. And then in the next photo, we have the sawmill that was located at Parsons, which processed a lot of timber that was coming out of both Randolph and Tucker County. So if logging wasn't enough, sort of the final chapter in the destruction of the Allegheny forest came in the form of fire. So, and that's likely what probably drives the current distribution that we see of the Cheat Mountain salamander now. Now, these fires were all extensive and catastrophic. And the first big fire that we really had in the state occurred in 1863, and it originated from the campfire of Confederate scouts that were up near the Roaring Plains area of the Dolly Sods Wilderness. Now, for many years thereafter, destructive fires swept through the region from the head of the Greenbrier River, which is in the south of the Mon Forest, along the sides and the top of the Allegheny Mountains through Pendleton, Randolph, Grant, and Tucker counties. Now, it is important to note that those 4 counties that I just listed are 4 out of the 5 counties in which the current distribution of Cheat Mountain salamanders are contained. So as these areas were clear cut, anything that wasn't marketable, so things like branches or tree crowns, were lopped off and left in the forest in these huge slash piles. And these conditions sort of created a tinderbox just waiting for a spark. So this old photo that we have here on our screen, it's a little bit poor quality, but this was a clear cut that was then burned to bedrock by fire. And this old photograph looks from Canaan Mountain out into the Dolly Sods Wilderness. So this fire was said to burn for 6 months, and the smoke could be seen from surrounding cities like Parsons, Elkins, and Davis. Now, if you were to walk up to Canaan Mountain today, that summit is still devoid of all trees and soil. So all that remains now is just bare rock. This is a photo of Canaan Mountain, which is beside Canaan Mountain. Again, we had a very destructive fire roll through here, and all that remains now are exposed bedrock with very little vegetation or rocks, or soil. So this is what it looks like present day. This is the peak of Canaan Mountain up here on your left, looking down into the valley. And over here, we have a photo from Dr. Pauli of rocks that were exposed after fires at Dobbins Slashing, which is near the Allegheny Front and Dolly Sods. So fire did play a huge role in the Central Appalachians, especially in West Virginia, and definitely influenced the current distribution that we see of the Cheat Mountain salamander. So in response, in part, or in reaction to these devastating logging practices, the Monongahela National Forest was established. So on November 26, 1915, the federal government used the Weeks Act to purchase the first tract that would become the Monongahela National Forest. Now that tract consisted of 7,200 acres in Tucker County. Now between the years of 1915 and 1920, there were additional tracts that were purchased and added to the forest. And then finally in 1920, President Woodrow Wilson signed the proclamation that established the Monongahela National Forest that then consisted of about 54,000 acres. Since 1920, of course, we have added to that with many additional tracts and have also designated several wilderness-only zones within this forest. All right, so now that we have hopefully a good understanding, a little bit of the history in Appalachia, why we have this biodiversity, and what occurred within the Monongahela National Forest, I wanted to briefly touch on amphibian declines and then talk about what you guys are all here to listen to me talk about, which is plethodon salamanders. So there is a reason why most of this research that is targeted on plethodon and salamanders and amphibians as a whole is very important right now. And that's because amphibian populations worldwide are in a state of global decline. And we also have species extinctions within the taxa or within amphibian taxa that are occurring at an alarming global rate. So there are about 6 factors that have been attributed to the cause of this decline. But habitat loss and fragmentation, as well as climate change, are among the most critical for amphibian species, especially here in the United States. So in recent years, the amount of research that has been centered around this decline has been substantially increased. So a lot of efforts are trying to understand and mitigate the impacts on species, particularly those that are species of concern. So amphibians, if we look at this figure on the slide, we can see that amphibians do have the greatest number of vulnerable species when compared to other taxa, such as birds, fish, mammals, and reptiles. They do have the highest number of species that are classified as critically endangered, endangered, and vulnerable. They also have the highest number of species that are classified as data deficient. And what that means is that we don't have enough data to make determinations about their status. So there are many species of amphibians, so anurans and salamanders, that we cannot determine if they fall into these categories because the research hasn't been conducted and we just don't have enough data. Most studies that have been focused on salamanders have really been geared toward climate change. And this is these are a couple of studies that came out of this region by Dr. Bill Sutton, as well as Carl Jacobson, who was a master's student in the lab that I'm currently a part of. Now, most of these climate change studies project the continuation of these salamander declines will increase as things like climate change and land use change progress. So a little bit of background on plethodon and salamanders. So plethodon is a genus in the family of a genus of salamanders in the family Plethodonidae. They are also known as woodland salamanders, or less commonly known as slimy salamanders. They're completely terrestrial and they respire through their skin. And all members of the genus are endemic to North America. So that's Canada and the USA. There are about 56 species of plethodons that have been described, and most of these do occur in the Appalachian Mountains. So plethodons, like I said before, they are lungless, so they respire through their skin or their mouths. They go through a process called cutaneous respiration for that gas exchange. They have nasal labial grooves that aid in chemoreception, and they also have tail autonomy. So this is used as a defense mechanism. Where they're approached by a predator, they will drop their tail that moves through muscle memory, and that will give them a chance to escape that predator because the predator then focuses on the tail. Now, salamanders are really cool, especially plethodons, because they have the ability to regenerate their tails as well as full limbs and toes, and even some internal organs that become damaged. So another fun fact about plethodon salamanders is that they skip the process of metamorphosis entirely. So whenever we think about amphibians, whether it be ambistomas, so pond breeding salamanders, or frogs, we think about this, this tri-life stage, right? Where they lay aquatic eggs, those eggs hatch out into aquatic larvae, and then they go through this process of metamorphosis to basically turn into their terrestrial stage. Now, plethodons go through the process of direct development, where these eggs are laid underneath a cover object, so something like a log or a rock. The female will stay with those gelatinous eggs and guard them until they hatch. And whenever they hatch, they come out as miniature, fully formed adults. So this is actually a US dime that this little guy is hanging out on. And in about 4 to 5 years for this species, which is the eastern redback salamander, they will grow into their adult phase. So if we take a look at these eggs, which this might be a really poor quality photo, but this is the best that I can do with my photography skills, we can kind of see what I'm talking about here with these miniature adults that form within these eggs. So if we look here, these yellow things are the yolk. And we can see the red backs of the juvenile salamanders or the neonate salamanders in these eggs. So plethodons generally prefer to be in cool and humid microclimates. Now, typically they are found in mature upland forests with closed canopy. Most of the time they avoid forest edges because near forest edges, there is an increase in ambient temperature, both in the air as well as soil temperature, and there's also a decrease in moisture. So they do prefer areas with some sort of cover, whether that be detritus or leaf cover and moss cover. And what this cover provides them is a higher moisture content, less solar radiation, so they're protected from that sunlight, and less wind, which actually can remove moisture from a microclimate. Now in West Virginia, our plethodons can be found under a variety of cover objects. They can be found just by sifting through the leaf litter. They really like to hide under rocks and logs. And then we also have some species like the green salamander, which isn't truly a plethodon, but it is in the Plethodonidae family, which lives most of its life within these rocky outcrops. So it is classified as an arboreal salamander, and it rarely comes down to the forest floor. Now we do have, like I mentioned before, several species of endemics that occur within the central Appalachians. So they range anywhere from the yellow-spotted woodland salamander, which was recently described by Dr. Zach Felix down in southern West Virginia and was named after Dr. Thomas Pauli. We have the valley and ridge salamander, or Hoffmanni, which occurs east of the Allegheny Front. We have the Shenandoah salamander, which is only found in 3 peaks in Shenandoah National Park. The Shenandoah mountain salamander, which occurs along the West Virginia-Virginia border. The Peaks of Otter salamander, and of course the Cheat Mountain salamander, which occurs only within West Virginia. We also have the cow-knob salamander, which is related to Worley salamanders, which can only be found in the George, Washington, and Jefferson National Forest on the West Virginia-Virginia line. The Dixie Cavern salamander, which is associated with a cavern system in Virginia near Blacksburg. And then, of course, the big level salamander, which is only found on a few peaks as well. Now, most of these species are considered to be montane, meaning that they are associated mostly with high elevations and those cooler microclimates. So let's talk a little bit about the Cheat Mountain salamander, which is why I'm here. I do have a question in the chat. So do you know if salamanders are affected by the invasive Asian jumping worm? Nancy, I'm not sure. I do know that we haven't documented any negative impacts on species that we study here in West Virginia. That's a really good question. So most of my research is focused on the Cheat Mountain salamander. So this species was federally threatened. That was first described in 1935. It occurs in the high Allegheny Mountains of eastern West Virginia, mostly within the Monongahela National Forest. So to date, there have been records of this species in 5 counties. Those counties include Pendleton, Pocahontas, Randolph, Grant, and Tucker counties. The species is largely associated with mixed forests of red spruce and yellow birch, and it's also been documented in a few eastern hemlock stands. There have been about 80 populations that have been described over the years, and most of those populations are geographically isolated from one another. So there's not a lot of genetic flow between populations. So I included this figure over here from a study that was conducted out of Marshall University. So this was a master's student named Whitney Crochelle, and she looked at sites that were historically visited in 1978. And then she went back and visited them again in 2011. Now, these sites ranged a wide variety of elevations. And in 1978, this salamander was pretty abundant, right? We have a high level of occupancy at most elevations that were examined. However, when we look at the data from 2011, we can see a decline in almost every elevation that was previously occupied by the Cheat Mountain salamander. So this is thought not only to be caused by habitat degradation, but also by climate change and a little bit of interspecific competition pressure. So I wanted to give you guys a brief history on the Cheat Mountain salamander. So as I previously mentioned, this species was discovered on June 25th in 1935 by students from the Ogle Bay Nature Training School. So they were out searching Barton Knob, which is a locality in Randolph County, with Graham netting, and they found 3 known species of salamander and 1 unknown species. Now, it's important to note that this 1 unknown species was the first documentation of Cheat Mountain salamanders in the state. So in 1938, Dr. Green from Marshall University actually went to Barton Knob after speaking with Graham netting, and he collected 11 specimens of this unknown salamander. He took them back to Marshall, and he actually described this new species as plethodon netting eye in honor of his friend Graham netting. So the Barton Knob locality and most of the Mauer tract was owned by a private company called the Mauer Company. And most of this area was heavily logged and mined prior to being acquired by the forest. And unfortunately, since that mining process, there have been no records of Cheat Mountain salamanders after that mining took place. So this photo on your right is actually an aerial view of Barton Knob before the U.S. Forest Service obtained the tract and added it to the Monongahela National Forest. Now, the United States Forest Service, after an extensive review process, actually did list the Cheat Mountain salamander as federally threatened on September 28th, 1989. So you can't really talk about Cheat Mountain salamanders unless you talk about this guy. So this is Dr. Thomas Pauli. He's professor emeritus at Marshall University. He's one of my committee members and probably one of my favorite people in the world. So I think this quote that I took, that he told us at the Cheat Mountain Salamander workshop in 2021 really sums up his involvement with the Cheat Mountain salamander. So he said, "I started working with the Cheat Mountain salamander before many of you were even born in 1975. I spent 46 years in the Allegheny Mountains of West Virginia chasing this species." So Dr. Pauli was first aware of the Cheat Mountain salamander whenever he was a graduate or whenever he was in school at Marshall University under Dr. Green. He was then contracted by the Forest Service to start the monitoring protocols, and he spent many years of his career walking through these mountains trying to find and discover new populations of the Cheat Mountain salamander. Most of the conservation actions that we have in place for this species, as well as most of the research that's taken place, has been a direct result of Dr. Pauli. All right, so let's talk about some major threats that we that are impacting the Cheat Mountain salamander, as well as other montane plethodonids within this region. So I mentioned this before, that climate change was one of the most critical threats that we see to plethodon species. So in Central Appalachia and in West Virginia, we do expect an increase in annual temperature. There's also projected to be a decrease in precipitation frequency. So this means that the timing between rain events will increase. So we'll have these extended periods of drought. And when it finally does rain, the severity of those rain events will increase, meaning we'll have a lot more flooding events. We're already seeing evidence of this within Appalachia with several 100-year floods that are happening at quicker intervals. So some of these more generalist species might be able to adapt to these warmer temperatures that we expect to see, or they might be able to extend their range either northward or to higher elevations. But high elevation species are usually already on top of the mountains, so there's nowhere for them to really go. And often they're specialized for cool microclimates, and they can be easily stressed whenever they're exposed to increased temperatures or drought. Now, many of these montane species, like I said before, they don't have the option to move to more favorable conditions because they can't migrate through those warmer valleys to locate those cooler conditions because of their low vigility, which means their movement ability, and their lack of tolerance to increased temperatures. So this is sort of, I put this figure in here to illustrate what I'm talking about with temperature changes. This is for the whole state of West Virginia. on average, we are seeing a positive trend in our state. And based on both lower emissions and higher emissions, we do expect that trend to continue. When we look specifically at our study area, so this is data from a paper that we recently published, we did detect a minimum or a positive trend in our minimum temperature in coldest quarter, so that's winter, for our contemporary baseline climate conditions, as well as an increase in mean monthly precipitation. Now, again, the important thing to remember about this increase in precipitation is that you're going to have those longer durations of drought and also more severe rain events. So the second critical threat to cheat mountain salamanders and plethodon salamanders is habitat fragmentation. So habitat fragmentation is only secondary to habitat loss. And oftentimes habitat fragmentation results in the isolation of populations because the links between habitat patches are destroyed. And this can result in the elimination of individuals or even entire populations from the landscape. So isolated populations are more likely to go extinct than connected metapopulations. And over time, habitat fragmentation can lead to decreased genetic diversity between populations. Over then. So there are a couple of different types of habitat fragmentation, but one of the most common in the Central Appalachians is linear forest fragmentation. So this is a common practice that is associated with the creation and maintenance of things like pipeline right-of-ways and power line right-of-ways, as well as roads and trails. So in addition to habitat degradation, linear forest removal can fragment populations of terrestrial salamanders. You also have what's called interior edge effects from this linear forest removal that can result in the degradation of adjacent forest habitat, often altering the microclimate. So you have higher temperatures and lower moisture in areas that are adjacent to that canopy removal. So on this slide, we have two examples of linear forest removal in the Monongahela National Forest. So on your left, we have a ski slope that's in Tucker County, West Virginia. It's very well maintained and it has no vegetation or trees within that slope, but you can also see these small pockets of forested habitat that are dissected by these ski slopes. And then over here on your right, this is the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, which transects the Monongahela National Forest. Again, we can see this large swath of forest has been clear. During the development process, there's no vegetation present on that right of way. And when vegetation does rebound, usually it's in the form of grasses or forbs, which offer little protection for plethodon salamanders. So probably the last critical threat to the cheat mountain salamander is interspecific competition. Now, this is a form of competition in which different species that occur together in an ecosystem compete for shared resources. So this can include things like refugia, nesting sites, or food. And interspecific competition actually can reduce the availability of those resources, which can hinder the reproductive process of some populations. Now, interspecific competition can also be compounded by habitat fragmentation and climate change. So those other two threats can increase the pressure from interspecific competition. And this type of competition can also influence the distribution and abundance of some high elevation salamanders. So there have been instances that have been documented with the eastern redback salamander, plethodon cinereus, where it's actually able to limit the geographic distribution of its conspecifics. So the main competitor species for the cheat mountain salamander is the eastern redback salamander. Now, this species is considered to be more of a generalist with a very widespread range that extends from Quebec down to North Carolina and then westward to Minnesota. So historically, this species was more of a low elevational species, but it's thought that due to climate change, it's been able to, again, extend that elevational range upward into sites that were historically dominated by more montane species. So the eastern redback salamander has been documented in recent decades to outcompete the cheat mountain salamander for things like refugia, food resources, and nesting sites. With the eastern redback salamander, they're a little bit more hardy than other plethodon species that you'll find in this region because they do have that widespread range. So they've actually been documented in areas that occur within 20 meters from opening edges if they have sufficient refugia, so things like rocks and logs. So this is probably the result of their ecological tolerance, and we'll talk about that in the next slide, as well as their higher thermal maximum. So like I mentioned before, other imperiled species have been documented to have reduced numbers in documented areas where they occur in sympatry with eastern redback salamanders. So I mentioned ecological tolerance on the previous slide, and I wanted to expand on that a little bit more about what I mean whenever I say ecological tolerance. So physiological traits can influence the ability of some species to colonize and persist in areas that are subjected to major disturbances. So woodland salamanders, they are especially sensitive to microclimate conditions because they require these cool and moist areas for cutaneous respiration for gas exchange. So species and populations often vary in their moisture and thermal tolerance requirements and their acclimation abilities as well. So there was a study from Markle and Kozak in 2018 that looked at the thermal capacity of 16 plethodon species, and they found that the size of the geographic range was positively correlated with the capacity of an organism to acclimate to increased temperatures. So they also found that eastern redbacks, which remember is the main competitor species for the Cheat Mountain salamander, had the greatest thermal acclimation capacity of the 10 species of plethodons that they looked at. And many field studies indicate that redback salamander populations are negatively impacted by timber harvests, but those populations are also capable of really persisting in those areas that are deemed degraded or suboptimal. So they can actually hang out and persist in areas that would be classified as non-ideal for other species of plethodons. So the leading hypothesis, again, for why CMS, the distribution of CMS is the way that it is because they were able to find refugia on these peaks of these mountains from that fire that burned most of the Monongahela National Forest throughout the range. So they relied on these exceptionally rocky substrates to be able to persist through those clear cutting and burning activities. All right, so I think I have about 10 minutes and then I'll give 10 minutes for questions. So I briefly wanted to talk about the research that I am doing here at West Virginia University, and also a couple of interesting things that we found. So I'm going to talk about two of the chapters from my dissertation. The first is looking at impacts of linear disturbance on a Cheat Mountain salamander population in Tucker County, West Virginia. And the next chapter I'm going to talk about is the projected contemporary and future habitat suitability for Cheat Mountain salamanders and the eastern redback salamanders. So the purpose of our research looking at that linear forest removal was to look at the occupancy dynamics of the Cheat Mountain salamander and the eastern redback salamander in response to that forest clearing. So we had a 28-year database that was collected by Dr. Pauli over at Marshall University, and we were able to use dynamic occupancy models to analyze that data set. So as I previously mentioned, this ski resort or this linear forest removal occurred within the Monongahela Forest in Tucker County, West Virginia. So this ski resort opened in 1986, and those trees for the ski slope that directly impacted a population of Cheat Mountain salamanders were removed in 1986. Now, this was prior to the 1989 listing, but under the operating agreement with the Monongahela National Forest, this ski resort had to monitor that population of salamanders. So Dr. Pauli came in and he established 43 monitoring plots that ranged anywhere from 4 to 80 meters from that ski slope or that linear forest clearing. Those plots were surveyed annually from 1988 to 2021, and West Virginia University has now taken over the monitoring of that site. So we conducted 1 to 3 surveys per year. And then we made sure that whenever we were conducting these surveys that we only went out whenever conditions were optimal. So we made sure that we went out within 48 hours of a rain event and when temperatures were warm enough to see that species above the ground. So I mentioned previously that we analyzed this data set using dynamic occupancy models. I'm not going to bore you with the technical mumbo jumbo for that modeling framework, but I did want to talk about some of the conclusions that we had. So our results did indicate that linear forest fragmentation, so that linear forest removal of high elevations in the Central Appalachians could influence salamander occupancy dynamics and also impact the adjacent mature forest. So it is well documented from other studies that fragmentation of mature forests does influence microclimate conditions near forest edges, and this often results in more extreme air and soil temperatures, lower humidity, as well as decreased soil moisture. So our results actually indicated that forest fragmentation negatively impacted that microhabitat for cheat mountain salamanders, which is consistent with previous work that occurred in the Monongahela National Forest. There were documented higher air temperatures and lower humidity in these areas that were impacted. And previous work has shown that cheat mountain salamanders really select for lower air temperatures and higher humidities because their thermal maximum is much narrower than the more generalistic species. In addition, our results also indicated that this linear forest removal either increased microhabitat quality for the redbacks, or it allowed this competitor species to capitalize on reduced competition from CMS near the edge. So once this linear forest removal occurred, CMS went extinct in the sites that were adjacent to that linear forest removal, and the redbacks were able to come in and establish in those sites that were suboptimal for the cheat mountain salamander. So the next part of my research looked at developing habitat suitability models for both of our focal species, which were the cheat mountain salamander and the eastern redback salamander. We also, in addition to projecting to contemporary climatic conditions, we wanted to project that into the future to see how climate change would have the impacts of climate change on that habitat suitability. So in order to do this, we took the current known distribution of the cheat mountain salamander and we created a 30-kilometer buffer around that area to make sure that we included all areas that could be potentially suitable for the cheat mountain salamander. We took our occurrence data from the West Virginia Herpetofauna database, which is maintained and collected by Dr. Pauli, and we further restricted our study area to elevations that were greater than 700 meters because we know that cheat mountain salamanders are a montane species. They will only be found at elevations greater than this. Now, most of the Monongahela National Forest was contained within the study area because that is where most of our high elevations occur within eastern West Virginia. So we used a random forest modeling framework. And again, I'll skip over the more technical parts. But we were able to use contemporary baseline climatic conditions to project habitat suitability onto the landscape. So on your left-hand side, this is for the cheat mountain salamander for contemporary conditions. And we can see a lot of these high elevation areas that are coming up as highly suitable for this species. When we look at the eastern redback salamander, which is the figure on your right, we can see that it sort of is a mirror image of what we see for the cheat mountain salamander. So most of those high elevation areas that are highly suitable for the cheat mountain salamander are classified as low suitability for the eastern redback salamander. Now, I mentioned previously that we then use this habitat suitability model to project to futuristic conditions. So when we look at the changes from contemporary to the year 2050 for the cheat mountain salamander, we can see that most of our highly suitable areas that were identified by the model have mostly disappeared by the year 2050. There are a couple areas of climatic refugia that persist under this emission scenario, but most of that highly suitable area is now not available to the salamander. For the eastern redback salamander, we see the opposite effect. So when we project this habitat suitability model to 2050, using the 8.5 emission scenario, we can see that most of the area that was originally classified as low suitability is now coming up as either moderately or highly suitable, indicating that as the Cheat Mountain salamanders lose habitat suitability within this range, the eastern redback salamander is able to increase in these areas because this area is becoming more suitable to that eastern redback salamander. So from this research, we can conclude a couple of things. So we already knew that Cheat Mountain salamanders were restricted to high elevations. And we also know that their occurrence is generally correlated with red spruce. Now, with climate change, we also expect red spruce forests to be impacted as well. So there is a projection that most of the red spruce forests that we have here in West Virginia will be eradicated, with a few places serving as climatic refugia. We see that same trend with our Cheat Mountain salamanders. So those areas of suitable habitat are further reduced by climate change in the East Allegheny Mountains. And these areas of suitable habitat for eastern redback salamanders are again projected to increase. So there is that potential for climate change to increase that competition pressure from the eastern redback salamanders on the Cheat Mountain salamanders. So my research has a couple of different implications. So we were able to prove the effects of, or not prove, but support the effects of linear fragmentation, which are commonly associated with things like power line and pipeline right-of-ways, which there's a big boom for in West Virginia. And we know that those effects can extend beyond the area that is cleared and can actually impact salamander community compositions in adjacent mature forest. We also know that maintaining and restoring intact mature forest will benefit the Cheat Mountain salamanders, right? Because connectivity between habitat patches can help with gene flow and adaptations and acclimations. From our habitat suitability model, we know that climate change is going to be a major struggle when it comes to recovering the species. We know that they're going to lose most of their climatically suitable habitat by the year 2050. So we hope that our habitat suitability models are going to support those managing agencies such as the U.S. Forest Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the West Virginia DNR in the active management of the Cheat Mountain salamander. And we hope that our habitat suitability model will be used for as a tool for climate change adaptation actions. So what does all this mean? Is there anything we can do? Is there any mitigation efforts that we can sort of employ in order to ensure that this species is able to hang around so that future generations can enjoy it? So the first recommendation that we gave to the Forest Service is to really maintain those contiguous patches of red spruce. We know that they're associated with that forest type. So obviously maintaining and restoring any degraded areas that are adjacent to populations is really important for their survival. We also want to try to protect areas that serve as climatic refugia, which are identified through the model for these salamanders. We want to really try to limit any habitat fragmentation or drastic timber management in areas that contain or are adjacent to known populations, because we know that that canopy removal negatively impacts them. We have also talked about the potential of removing competitor species. So we know that interspecific competition is a huge threat to this species, and actually going in and removing competitor species could relieve some of the pressure that's put on these individuals by competitors. We also have talked a little bit about cross-stocking, which is a last case scenario thing. That's when we'll take individuals from the wild and move them to more favorable areas. The important thing to note about cross-stocking for any reptile or amphibian species is it has a really low success rate. So it is often used as sort of the worst case scenario or the last ditch effort to save a species. So I'd like to give a few acknowledgements just really briefly. Lucas Price and Joel Moda for letting me practice this presentation on them. Also other graduate students at West Virginia University, my co-investigators, in particular, my advisor, Dr. Donald Brown, who's out of the Northern Research Station for the Monongahela National Forest, Dr. Thomas Pauli, of course, the U.S. Forest Service Northern Research Station, who funded a good majority of my work, as well as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and specifically the West Virginia Field Office, and then the Marshall University students and other volunteers that assisted in data collection. With that, I will take questions. I think we have about 7 minutes, hopefully.
If you don't mind, stop sharing your screen, Lacy, and we can come back together and people can just drop their questions down in the chat box.
Sounds good. So Trevor, that's a really good question. For the competitor species that are removed, there's a couple of different options, really 2 options. They can either be moved to areas where cheat mountain salamanders aren't known to occur. So you could take the eastern redbacks and put them in a different area, or you could euthanize them. Obviously, like, we want to lessen our impacts on the environment. So euthanasia would not be the desirable option. It would be more favorable to relocate them. And I do want to point out that we are currently not removing competitor species from areas at this time. This is just something that we are thinking about as an adaptation or a plan to mitigate these impacts.
So while we wait for other questions, Lacy, are you hopeful for the future of the cheat mountain salamander?
Oh, that's a really good question. I try not to be a pessimistic person, but looking at those maps that I showed you guys, it is, it's not looking good for them at all, right? So unless we do some major emissions work, I don't know, unless we step in and really, go through cross-stocking or competitor removal, if we're going to be able to recover that species. So somebody asked, have you done any sampling in areas that have been replanted or been in contact? Yes. So Jody, I work with the Nature Conservancy here in Elkins, West Virginia. We actually did a pilot study about 2 years ago on the Mauer Tract, which contains Barton Knob, which is the locality for the cheat mountain salamander. We looked at areas that were previously strip mined and had been replanted in red spruce, and we compared them to other treatments that are occurring on the Mauer Tract to get rid of Norway spruce, which is what they planted after they mined, and replant that with red spruce. We also compared that to areas where we know that cheat mountain salamander populations occur. We did find that at the early stages of restoration, that the microclimate conditions just aren't there yet, but it is important to note that the bulk of this work has only been going on for about 15 years. So a lot of these areas, the trees aren't established enough to serve as that canopy, but there is hope, maybe. So somebody else asked, what other competitor species are there other than redbacks? That's a really great question. So there are 2 other primary competitor species that we see in CMS populations, and those are the Allegheny Mountain dusky, or Desmognathus acrophius, which is one of the more terrestrial species of desmogs. And then we also have the whirly salamander, plethodon whirlii. It is important to note that redbacks are really the ones that can outcompete the cheat mountain salamander. It seems like whirly salamanders are showing up in these areas, but they're not outcompeting them for like food resources or nesting sites. They're mostly outcompeting them for refugia, those moist areas. So what ecological role do salamanders contribute to? Yeah, that's a really good question, Mary. So salamanders have the highest biomass in our forests, and they take care of a lot of inverts. So that's primarily what they feed on. And they also serve as a prey item for many other taxa. So they are an important cog in the ecosystem. And a lot of people like to say that, well, why do we care about the cheat mountain salamander? Like, it seems like it's not doing good. And it seems like this redback can just step in and take the role of the cheat mountain salamander. But I think there's a flaw in that thinking, right? So we, as humans, we don't understand every ecosystem service that these salamanders offer to our areas. And, just just saying that we should wash our hands of a species just because we have another species that can step in, it's very short-sighted, and it's not really serving as a good steward of the land. So these salamanders are important to our ecosystems, and we should try to mitigate the things that we've done to impact their home, essentially, and make it not ideal. I hope that answers your question, Mary. Yeah. So Trevor says, with relocation being the preferred option, would there be an option to sell competitors in the pet trade before euthanasia? Yeah, so that is an interesting idea. So the problem with amphibian species is that, I don't know if you're familiar, Trevor, but a lot of people, especially in the Southeast, they have problems with people releasing captive held individuals into the wild. So with amphibians, this creates a couple different problems. The first big issue is disease. So amphibians do have the potential to be completely devastated by naive populations have the potential to be devastated by novel diseases. So we're seeing a lot with ranavirus. Yeah, exactly. Ranavirus in like frogs and toads, as well as some chytrid stuff that's going on down in South America. So there is that disease consideration for captive individuals. I'm not really sure. I think that would be a question for someone who is more into policy. As someone who has had to go through the husbandry of salamanders, it's a very difficult process to keep them alive because they do have these strict temperature and moisture requirements that you have to adhere to. So they are a little bit more difficult for husbandry than compared to like snakes or turtles. So that's an interesting question. Let's see. Trevor, I hope that answered your question. Christina asked, how long do plethodons live? Was surprised to hear it takes 4+ years. Yeah, so some plethodons in captivity can make it anywhere from 15 to 20 years. We don't really have good estimates in the wild because they're super hard to study. So with plethodon salamanders in a population, there's only about probably 20% maybe of the population that's available at the surface level at any given moment. Most of the time they are subsurface, like underground, moving through like tunnels or rock shelves. So it's really hard to get back captured individuals that have been marked. We've currently started using pit tags. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, but it's a passive integrated technology where they can be scanned with a reader and an individual ID pops up. And so that's becoming more common in salamander research. So I think that's going to give us an answer to your question as that is adapted into more protocols and methodologies. All right, let's see. Rich asks, is the replanting of red spruce being done in a method trying to recreate the virgin forest or simply to restock timber? Yeah, so Rich, they are replanting this red spruce in these mining areas with the intent of restoring that forest. It's not for timber production. Like these areas will be protected, and they've actually used what we call parent trees. So red spruce seedlings and saplings can be susceptible to like high temperatures from open canopy. So they're using things like aspen and other tree species to serve as parent trees to protect those seedlings and saplings, so that they can establish under the protection of that parent tree. But yeah, it's not for timber stocking. Most of the areas that are red spruce are protected from any sort of timber harvesting. Now, the Norway spruce, on the other hand, that's an invasive. So they are trying to get rid of as much of that as they can and replant that with native red spruce.
Do we have any other questions? We'll give it a minute and see. Okay, well, I guess that is it for you tonight, Lacy. Thank you so much for coming and teaching us about Sheep Mountain salamanders. I definitely miss salamanders every day. Okay, have a good night, everybody.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, guys. I hope you guys learned something. And if you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email. Thanks, guys.